All right, let's dive in. Today we're going deep into something I find really fascinating, the influence of folk music on classical music.
It's amazing, isn't it, how these seemingly simple tunes could spark such incredible creativity in some of the biggest names in classical music.
Yeah, you think of these big orchestral works,
Mm-hmm.
and then you realize that hidden in there are these echoes of tunes that have been passed down through generations, like from rural communities.
Exactly. Folk music, at its heart, it's all about storytelling. It's the music of everyday people, their lives, their loves, their struggles, all woven into these melodies and lyrics that have been passed down, often orally, over centuries.
Right, so it's like this direct line to the heart of a culture, almost like a musical time capsule.
I love that, a musical time capsule. And what makes it even more interesting is that a lot of composers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were actively seeking out these folk tunes. Like they were almost on a mission to discover these hidden treasures.
It was a time of intense nationalism in
Sure.
Europe, right? So composers were looking for ways to create music that reflected their own national identity, something that felt distinct from the dominant Western European traditions.
Exactly. They wanted to create something that was uniquely their own, and they found inspiration in the music of their own people, the music that had been there all along.
And that's where our two stars of the show come in, Béla Bartók and Ralph Vaughan Williams. These guys weren't just composers, they were obsessed with folk music.
They were true pioneers.
Mhm.
Bartók, he was Hungarian, and he was particularly fascinated by the folk music of Eastern Europe. He and his friend Zoltán Kodály, they traveled all over the countryside with these were the early days of recording technology with these Edison phonographs.
Wow, can you imagine lugging those things around, trying to capture these fragile melodies in these remote villages?
It was an incredible undertaking, and they weren't just recording, they were meticulously transcribing, analyzing, trying to understand the structure, the scales, the rhythms, the very essence of these folk tunes.
So Bartók wasn't just a composer, he was like an early ethnomusicologist.
He was one of the founders of the field, really. He saw music not just as sounds, but as a window into a culture's soul, its history, its identity.
And all of this research, all of this immersion in folk music, it had a profound impact on his own compositions, right?
Without a doubt, you can hear those folk influences woven into the fabric of his music. Like, take his Romanian folk dances, for example. He's not just inspired by folk music. He's directly adapting those vibrant tunes, bringing them into the classical concert hall.
And it's not just the melodies, it's the rhythms, the harmonies, the scales, those unusual modes, all of those elements that he discovered in his research, they all find their way into his music, sometimes subtly, sometimes front and center.
Exactly. And then you have pieces like Microcosmos, this collection of piano pieces that on the surface, they look like teaching exercises, but listen closely and you start to hear those folk rhythms, those unusual scales.
It's like you can't escape those sounds. They're so deeply embedded in his musical DNA.
And then, as he matures as a composer, you get these larger scale works like Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celesta, or his incredible Concerto for Orchestra, where he starts to blend those folk elements with more avant-garde techniques, creating this sound world that's both familiar and completely new.
He was pushing boundaries, challenging the norms of classical music, and in doing so, creating something truly unique.
Absolutely. Now let's turn our attention to Ralph Vaughan Williams, our other folk music enthusiast. He was English, and he was deeply committed to creating a distinctly English sound in his music.
I can picture him now traveling through the English countryside, notebook in hand, meticulously transcribing those tunes from those singers in rural pubs or those village gatherings.
He was on a mission to capture those melodies before they were lost. He collaborated with Cecil Sharp, another folk music enthusiast, and they worked tirelessly with the English Folk Song Society to preserve those traditions.
It was a race against time.
It was, and you can hear that love for English folk music, that dedication to preserving its essence in his compositions.
So, just like Bartók, Vaughan Williams went deep into the wellspring of folk music. But his approach was different, wasn't it?
Yes, definitely. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. We'll dig into those differences in a bit. But first, let's take a closer look at how each of these composers transformed those folk influences into something entirely their own.
Okay, so we've got these two musical giants, both deeply inspired by folk music, but their approaches were so different. What were some of the things they had in common?
Well, both Bartók and Vaughan Williams were passionate about preserving folk music. They saw it as this incredible treasure trove of cultural heritage, and they weren't afraid to shake things up in the classical music world by incorporating these folk elements into their works. Like they weren't just content to write music in the traditional style. They wanted to push boundaries.
It's like they were saying, hey, there's this whole other world of music out there, and it's just as valid, just as powerful, just as worthy of being heard as the traditional classical repertoire.
Exactly. And they both expanded the language of classical music, really, by introducing these new sounds, new ideas, new ways of thinking about rhythm and harmony and form.
Right. So they were both like deeply rooted in tradition, but also incredibly forward-thinking.
Exactly. But now let's get to the juicy part. The differences. Bartók seemed drawn to, well, I guess you could say, the raw energy of Eastern European folk music. He loved those irregular rhythms, those driving, almost aggressive, sometimes, melodies.
Vaughan Williams, on the other hand, his music often has this kind of like melancholic beauty to it, this sense of nostalgia, of longing.
It's like they each tapped into a different emotional vein within the world of folk music.
And their approaches to like actually integrating the folk material were also different. Bartók, he often used those folk melodies as like a starting point, a springboard for his own creative explorations. He would like take them apart, almost dissect them, and then reassemble them in new and surprising ways.
Whereas Vaughan Williams, he seemed more focused on capturing the essence of those original folk tunes. He would weave them into his compositions, but like he was very careful to preserve their integrity. He didn't want to distort them too much.
It's like Bartók is building a new structure using the raw materials of folk music, and Vaughan Williams is creating this intricate tapestry, carefully threading those folk melodies into the larger design.
I like that analogy. It really captures the essence of their different approaches.
So it's not just about the folk music itself. It's about how they each like internalized it, how they transformed it, how they made it their own.
And that's the magic of creativity, isn't it? You take inspiration from the world around you, you absorb it, you process it, and then you create something new, something that's uniquely your own.
And I think that's what makes both Bartók and Vaughan Williams so fascinating. They were both masters of their craft, but they also had this incredible ability to connect with something deeper, something primal, something that speaks to the human heart.
And that's what makes their music so enduring, so timeless. It speaks to something deep within us, something that transcends cultural boundaries, something that reminds us of our shared humanity.
Okay, I'm totally hooked now. I want to know more about how they actually did it, like the nitty-gritty of how they took these folk melodies and wove them into these incredible classical work.
All right, let's get technical.
Okay, so we've talked about their inspiration, their different approaches, but how do they actually do it? How did Bartók and Vaughan Williams weave those folk elements into their compositions?
It's like a magic trick, isn't it? Turning these simple folk tunes into, these grand orchestral works. It's all about understanding their craft. Let's start with Bartók, the master of those Eastern European folk sounds. One of his signature techniques was using these irregular rhythms and syncopation. Those unexpected accents, those offbeat pulses that make you want to move in a totally different way.
It's like he's taking those traditional dance steps from those village festivals, and he's translating them into this whole new rhythmic language for the orchestra.
Exactly. He was so inspired by the energy of those folk dances he'd seen, in his research, and he brought those pulsating patterns into his music. You can really hear it in pieces like his Romanian folk dances. The rhythms they jump off the page, or the Allegro Barbaro for piano. It's got this wild, almost like primal energy to it.
He wasn't afraid to shake things up a bit rhythmically, was he?
Not at all. And it wasn't just rhythm. Bartók also embraced those unique scales and harmonies he discovered in folk music. He went beyond those major and minor scales, the ones we're all used to hearing in Western classical music, and he started exploring these modal scales, like the pentatonic, the Dorian, the Phrygian modes. That's what gives his music that distinctly Eastern European flavor.
It's like he expanded the color palette of classical music.
Exactly. These modal scales, they evoke a sense of mystery, a connection to something ancient, something primal. You can really hear it in music for strings, percussion, and celesta. The harmonies in that piece, they're mesmerizing.
And Bartók was also a master of manipulating musical form. He'd take those those short folk melodies, and through a process of variation, he would like expand them, transform them into something totally new. It's like taking a little seed and growing it into this massive tree.
His microcosmos is a perfect example of that. It's this collection of piano pieces that on the surface, they look like, simple teaching pieces, but hidden inside are all these little explorations of folk-inspired rhythms and scales and forms.
Clever. Now, Vaughan Williams, his approach to incorporating English folk music had a different feel to it, didn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Bartók often used those folk tunes as, like, a starting point for his own creations.
Yeah.
But Vaughan Williams seemed more intent on, like, preserving the integrity of those original melodies, like weaving them directly into his composition.
He had this deep respect for the authenticity of those folk tunes. He would painstakingly transcribe them from the singers he met during his travels, capturing not just the notes, but the nuances, the little details, the things that made them unique.
It's like he was creating a sonic tapestry, weaving together threads of history and tradition and personal expression.
That's a great way to put it. And just like Bartók's fascination with those modal scales, Vaughan Williams was drawn to that modal character of English folk songs, those older church modes that give his music that timeless, almost spiritual quality, in Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis. It evokes those ancient English cathedrals, those rolling hills.
There's a grandeur, a solemnity to his music, isn't there?
Definitely. And let's not forget his mastery of harmony. He loved to use those lush chords, those overlapping chords. He was really drawn to using parallel harmonies, which create this sense of spaciousness, of grandeur. It's like those vast open skies you find in the English countryside.
It's like he's painting a picture of a place with sound.
Exactly. And he was also a master of counterpoint, the art of weaving together multiple melodic lines. But he infused that technique with his own folk-inspired sensibility. It gave it a fresh, a distinctly English sound.
So it's like he took those old musical traditions and gave them like a new voice.
He did. And it's important to remember that both Bartók and Vaughan Williams, they weren't just copying folk music. They weren't just borrowing melodies. They were absorbing those sounds, those rhythms, internalizing them, and then transforming them into something completely their own.
They weren't just composers, they were innovators.
They were pushing the boundaries of classical music while also honoring the traditions that came before.
Their music, it's a testament to the power of synthesis, to the creative possibilities that emerge when you bring those seemingly disparate elements together.
And it's a reminder that inspiration can come from the most unexpected places, even from those simple, humble folk tunes that have been passed down through generations.
Well, that brings our deep dive to a close. But before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to go out and discover more of Bartók and Vaughan Williams' music. There's so much to explore beyond, the well-known pieces.
Absolutely. There are so many hidden gems out there waiting to be discovered.
So go out there, listen, explore, and let yourselves be transported by the beauty and the power of their music.
And never underestimate the power of folk music. It's a wellspring of inspiration, a connection to our past, and a vital force for creativity in the present.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world where folk music meets classical composition. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore the rich tapestry of musical traditions that make our world so vibrant and beautiful.
Keep listening, keep exploring, and keep the music playing.